How you guys doing today? It's Anthony Ganji. Welcome to another episode of Tier Talk. Guys, we're going to dive right into this today. We're going to be talking about dealing with a disrespectful inmate. Now, guys, we've covered this topic before, but I feel it's time to revisit, maybe add a little more to it, because I've been getting some comments on my channel. People have been asking for assistance in dealing with disrespect, so I figure it's time to revisit. I think the last time we did a video on this topic was maybe a few years back. And today my guest is going to be Joe Pomponio. What up, Joe?
What's happening, Anthony?
Joe, do you mind introducing yourself, please?
Yes, sir. My name is Joe Pomponio. I'm a retired lieutenant from the Texas Department of Corrections, 29 years and 6 months. I'm currently working as an assistant jail administrator in our local county sheriff's department in the jail division and a panel member here for Tier Talk.
All right, Joe. So I believe I have 10 bullets here that we'll quickly go over. Just basically, I'll just say what the bullets are, and then we'll break them down and then go into the next bullet. But I do think it's time that we do have this discussion because it's been a while, and we know that obviously interactions with inmates have increased. So it's always good to revisit this topic, especially because we have newer people in the profession now than, obviously from 2 years ago, and we did it. So it's good to it's good to kind of introduce this topic once in a while, because definitely this is something you're going to cross into when you're working in corrections, prisons, jails, whatever, because in corrections, we are meant to chase conflict. And when you're chasing conflict, there's a chance that once in a while, you are going to deal with a disrespectful inmate. Now, Joe, I must say this. Something you said a while back on the channel, what you don't address, you bless.
Yep.
I've virtually heard kind of like what you ignore, you accept. And that kind of relates to this as well. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we deal with disrespectful people in all walks of life. However, in the corrections, you come across it more and more because these are people who, are not allowed to go home. They're contained in a facility. Pretty much all their freedom has been taken from them, and what little they have, they hold on to with value. So it's easy to come across an inmate who can be disrespectful.
Yeah, I just want to quickly give you a story that I remember. I've said it on the channel before, but I'll reiterate it. But when I was new in this profession, I remember the first inmate that I had a negative interaction with, and it was unique because I'd given the inmate an order. The inmate was doing the order, but they were a bit disrespectful in how I guess they were doing the order, because they were still mouthing off. And at that point, I felt this was my moment where I couldn't let my authority be challenged. So what happened was we wind up having a very negative back and forth. I don't think looking back, this was the best moment of my career. But I remember an officer, a senior officer who still works today, who took me aside and told me, "Hey, Ganj, if only you could have saw yourself dealing with that inmate." And it's like, it looks like the inmate got the best of you. You have to expect the inmate is going to mouth off a bit, but you also have to look at the environment. The inmates are reinforcing that. So here you are trying to correct her, but she's not willing to listen because the environment is reinforcing the negative behavior. So what you should have done, to be honest with you, is you should have pulled her, if it was safely to do so, pull her aside and talk to her, and you will get a whole different inmate. Control the environment, then you can control the inmate. He felt that at that moment, it was more about me chasing my pride. And I believe to some extent that was true, because at the very beginning, I felt the need to make sure that my authority wasn't in question. So anytime there was a slight disrespect, I felt I had to heighten my reaction, when, to be honest with you, that's when I learned the difference between being assertive and being aggressive. Literally, there was a senior officer that told me to pull the inmate aside, and you will find that you have a totally different inmate. And that was the case. And to be honest with you, later on, we wind up having a great respect for each other. But that moment didn't allow for that. And I will say this, one other thing. Inmates, I think they know what they need to be, but they may not always embrace it as something that they want to be. And you're sure as hell not going to be able to influence that transition with a bunch of other inmates around who are pushing the inmate into another direction that's opposite of where you want them to go. What's your thoughts on that, Joe, real quick?
Yeah, I mean, we've all been in in those scenarios, because we come through the academy, and the thing they kind of tell you is don't take no shit from them. And I've had similar interactions as a rookie officer. And there were times where I put myself in a position where it really could have been bad for me if it had broke south. Had one bumping his gums and being totally verbally disrespectful in front of his fellow inmates there. And of course, I'm by myself, and I kind of stepped to him and asked him to repeat himself, because I thought maybe I was having a hearing problem. And when he started to repeat himself, I got pretty much dead off in his ass verbally. Uh, Shouting match ensued. But when it was said and done, I kind of noticed that my lieutenant was standing behind me out of the corner of my eye, and I really didn't think much of it. And lieutenant kind of pulled me aside. He said, "Look, man, I appreciate the fact you stood up for yourself, and these inmates now know they're not going to take any shit, but you kind of stepped to this guy, and he had 8 other inmates with him, and probably wasn't the smartest thing to do, because they all could have gotten you." So the adrenaline goes, and the situation tends to get away from you. When they get the best of you, or you feel disrespected. You just gotta keep things in mind when you're dealing with inmates, because it doesn't take but one slip up for things to go south where you can get yourself hurt.
And guys, and we are saying that you have to address it, but you have to be mindful. This could be, especially at the very beginning of your career, this could be a constant thing. So it's not quick to always say, yeah, you got to write up every time you're disrespected. I mean, if that's the case, you're going to be flooding charges that are rather superficial. Your supervisor is going to wind up getting pissed off with you. So they're going to, we're going to expect you to handle some level of conflict. And also, there may be some level of disrespect, and we're going to see how you address that. I think that was a great moment for the senior officer to step back and not get directly involved. And you notice when I said the story, he didn't correct me in the moment. I mean, he didn't let it go, too far south down the rabbit hole either, but he allowed me to kind of take in what was happening and then go back and reflect. And that was key, because I couldn't deny the fact that at that point I was chasing for a win. I wasn't looking to resolve. I was looking to get the win. And right off the bat, that's where the back and forth became. Like, I'm not here technically to have the back and forth with an inmate, but that personalized win, that shot to my ego, that's what I was really chasing. So the first thing I got, and I think this makes sense, Joe, is to stay calm and professional. You got to avoid reacting emotionally or taking the disrespect personally. And you also have to maintain composure to keep control of the situation and yourself. And I think that's why it was very key for that senior officer, to kind of have that dialogue with me, because the one thing he wanted to say was you should have seen yourself. So basically, you may have lost control. And now when you have lost control, there's no way you can control the environment, let alone the inmate. And I say in that order for a reason. You must, if you're going to address this inmate, you must make sure it's safe to do so. So you must control that environment, make sure that there's no counter influence to what you're trying to push across. But the first thing you must do, is control yourself, control the environment if possible, and then you make an effort to control the inmate. But Joe, I think when it becomes emotional, when you start to take the disrespect personally, because again, we are expected to walk into this profession and deal with conflict, but when you start taking it personally, now I think you do start to lose that sense of control. And now it's not a matter of resolution, but rather I need to win. I need to get my pride back. I need to get that perception of authority back.
Yeah. Wearing your feelings on your sleeve is always a recipe for disaster. And staying calm and professionals is a must. Unfortunately, it took me over 30 years to kind of learn that myself, because I've always been pretty high strung for the most part. And working now in a county jail environment, it's especially dealing with more and more mental health people. You learn that being calm and professional kind of gets you a better understanding and also gets you a better response, especially when dealing with mental health inmates. There are going to be times in our careers where we have to get loud, where we have to get boisterous, where we have to get some attention. You got inmates fighting, got inmates going at it, inmates jumping on a staff member or whatever. There are going to be times where you have to kind of get out there in left field in order to get their attention to cease the situation. But once the situation is under control, then, you should go back to being calm and professional. But wearing your feelings on your sleeves. I mean, as many times as I've been cussed out in my career, I never really took that personal. Hell, half the time I didn't even write it up because, it didn't bother me like that. And, the inmates kind of respect me for the fact that, if they cuss me and I kind of got out there and left field with them and cussed them back, they also knew I wasn't fixing to write them up for it because the fact that, we both kind of got out there and, there's that mutual understanding that you're not going to run your head to me and me tolerate it. But staying calm and professional is always the best approach. If you go in there excited or you got your feelings on your sleeve or you're leading by emotion, it has a tendency of over ramping the situation and bringing it to a heightened sense to a point where it really doesn't need to go.
Yeah, and I like what you said, Joe. I mean, to be honest with you, as we're talking about, it's not personal. It's not personal. And if you allow the inmate to kind of push those buttons, what's to stop them from doing it again?
Absolutely.
That's the key. And that could be what they're trying to do. So I also have, and I think this isn't the right order, but I like this part, something that we never discussed before. But when I have assessed the situation, one of the things I want to mention here is you have to determine whether the behavior is intentional or reactionary, and then consider the environment and external factors reinforcing the behavior. So let me go back to the behavior. It's intentional or reactionary. Like, so you could have inmates that intentionally carry themselves that way. They like to be disrespectful. They like to challenge authority, and that could be a different, more long-term approach. But you also could have some inmates that could be caught up in the moment. It just could be something that's situational that maybe it is best for you to understand the situation that caused that reaction. And usually that happens when you have an inmate that could be normally respectful, and then all of a sudden something happens. They go outside the box, and people may want to jump and address the inmate and say, you know what, this is the inmate. And it's like, well, wait, hold on. What just happened? Oh, maybe they got a phone call that didn't go their way, or maybe there was a change in a rule that it's that they feel is not going their way. But either way, I think that it does make sense to kind of understand, I guess, behind whether it's intentional or whether it's reactionary is the motive behind the disrespect or the aggressive. I don't want to say aggressive resistance, but at some level, yeah, I guess you could say a disrespect to the authority that you possess. So I like the notion that there could be some that are intentional, which means it's just who they are and they know what they're doing, and it's just something that they constantly do. But there could be some where the situation gets the best of them, and at that point here, that could be different. It could be asking, hey, what's going on? What happened? You're not usually like this. Where did this change come from? And then, as I said, the behavior that allows for that to happen. So if I'm going to address that inmate, I have to make sure I don't address them in an area where basically there's more pressure for them to conform into the negative behavior than it is to be influenced by me into the right direction. So again, and that's something that you got to be aware of when it comes to looking at your environment. Like, you know what, I'm going to address this inmate here in front of all these other inmates who right now this guy's showboating, right? Because he has all the other inmates supporting it. There's no way I'm going to remove this inmate from his pedestal because he's going to be seen as weak. And then he's got to go back amongst his peers and be questioned. So that's just not the time to do it. The time to do it is when the inmate is away from those counter influences, and then you can have that one-on-one. But Joe, what's your thoughts on just that first part too, that determine whether the behavior is intentional or reactionary?
Yeah, especially as a supervision, that's why it's always important to walk around, know your inmates, know your staff, know your culture, know your climate. To have a full assessment and a bigger picture as to why situations are happening kind of gives you a better insight, and you also know, how you're going to handle the the incident itself. And just like you said, if you have one who's an asshole every day, you don't expect anything else from him. If he's an asshole every day and then suddenly he's nice, that's when you need to worry. If you got a guy that normally and generally doesn't have any issues, cause any issues, he kind of flies below the radar, does his own thing, and all of a sudden he's trying to kick the hinges off the door. Obviously there's something that sparked that. So he's reactionary to something. So it's always good to know your offenders, your inmates, just as much as your staff, because having a better dialogue and open lines of communication with the offender population will get you a lot further. Because if you know the inmate, his behaviorisms, his characteristics, and when he's normal, when he's not normal. So, management by walking around, especially for the sergeants and the lieutenants, is key. Sometimes we take keys from our frontline correctional officers. They'll call and say, "Hey, Lou, I got one down here. He's going off the rails down here. I don't know what the hell's going on with him. He won't talk to me, and he's normally not like this." So, sometimes you take clues from your staff as well, because they know the offenders, because they deal with them directly most of the time. We only deal with them when we absolutely have to, or, when an officer needs assistance. So, if you're walking around and you're involving yourself and your staff's involving themselves into the offender population, you'll know whether if it's intentional or reactionary.
Yeah, and I got to say something, guys. When it goes back to the reactionary side, that actually is a good time to draw on empathy. Very controlled, don't get me wrong, but professional empathy. I think understanding the situation and then trying to see if time permits and it's safe to do so, because this is part of the de-escalation now, is if you could shift the inmate's perspective in regards to what's causing the outbursts, as to related to how he's or she is dealing with the situation. So I think that the reactionary, to be honest with you, could be a surprise, but may give us a better chance to maneuver, especially if the inmate, it's a shift for the inmate. It's not who they are, where sometimes you do get those inmates that are attentional. They like to challenge, they like to push, and I mean, for there, you're going to need more patience. But with that said, most likely they're going to go right back to it again. I mean, it's just you may get through a moment, then they go back through it. But I think for the reactionary one, if you're an officer and you kind of are empathetic to what you find out what the situation is that could have caused it, and they're reacting to something, that can actually be a great resource for you and how you can maneuver to de-escalate the disrespect. Okay, so this is key, Joe. Don't chase pride. So obviously avoid engaging in back and forth arguments. It's not about winning, and then focus on the bigger picture, maintaining authority and controls. We talked about this, but real quick, just to focus on a little bit more. This is not about win or losing. It's about resolution. And that's a bit different. So therefore, if it's about win or losing, maybe you are trying to get that pride, and now you start to realize that you are not helping the situation, because now you are kind of at the same level as the inmate, and you're kind of just going back and forth, losing the composure because you feel that the inmate has attacked you personally, or has attacked your pride personally, or has attacked your position in which you're prideful about personally. So with that said, I think taking the mindset that it's not about winning or losing, but finding a resolution as long as time permits, and then basically trying to understand what the bigger picture is. The bigger picture is, in my mind, is ultimately I want to get a compliant inmate that is intentional with their compliance, and not someone that I'm going to have to kind of always force. So always when I direct an inmate that could be disrespectful, I am trying to look for a long-term resolution if time permits. I mean, granted, if there's an emergency going on and we're trying to nip it, then I'm going to be assertive and do what I can to get to where I need to be in that moment. But I think there's always that effort to try to make something long term, so you don't have to keep on revisiting these same issues. So with that said, I think understanding the big picture is, if I'm dealing with a disrespectful inmate, what is the foundational concerns, not the symptoms, but what are the foundational concerns that's causing this inmate to be disrespectful, so I can look at engaging in some level of long-term resolution if time permits. Would you agree with that? Especially, as I said, you don't want to chase pride. You don't want to make it a win-lose.
No, if it's a win-lose situation, then obviously you put yourself in a situation you shouldn't be in to begin with. You're not chasing the pride. Just remember, an asshole's an asshole. If he's an asshole today, he's going to be an asshole tomorrow. He's going to be an asshole 3 days from now. And, he'll give you plenty of opportunities to get him. My biggest thing is, when I'm backing up one of my officers and they're having a screaming match or they're cussing each other, whatever, my whole reason for being there is to gain compliance. If it was the fact that the officer told him to either get back in his cell or, whatever the order was, we're going to get compliance on that order first. And then we're going to deal with everything else secondary. There have been times where I've had to get on my officers because they're using language. There's times where I got to get on the inmates because they're using language. Sometimes I got to get on both of them because they're using language. But my kind of feeling is, coming into one of those situations, if the officer was trying to gain compliance and was in the right to begin with at the beginning of the scenario, and it just kind of escalated into a cussing match, like I tell the inmate, if I'm going to write my officer up, I'm going to write you up too. Two wrongs don't make a right, and I'll get compliance out of both of you. Chasing your pride can get you into a fix, especially if you're in a facility where you're wearing body cameras or, you got all these video cameras. And, don't get me wrong, there's going to be times where, like in a spontaneous use of force situation, where, things are going to be said in the heat of the moment, as you're having a use of force. And, that's, for the most part, it's kind of, almost to be expected because the adrenaline's going, you're being physical, and, things are taking place. They may be trying to attack you, whatever the case is. But, for the most part, don't insert yourself into a voluntary situation where you're chasing your pride. If you're trying to get compliance on an order, get the compliance on the order that you give. If you're not getting it, don't turn it into a cussing match. Call for a supervisor, let them come down there and help you get that compliance that you need.
Yeah, and guys, one of the things we're talking about here, guys, is you figure some of them probably will disrespect authority, but ultimately they learn to respect you as an individual. And I think that's ultimately what we shoot for. We want the respect to go beyond the uniform. And you can actually see that, because you can see some inmates that act like ass, all the time, that act totally disrespectful. But then they work with certain officers who can kind of, hey, not today. And the inmate will listen. Where if it's another one, they're going to keep on, rallying things up. So, again, it goes beyond your presence. It's more about you wearing the uniform than the uniform wearing you. Now, we kind of touched on this too real quick, but just to go back, it's about controlling the environment. So with that said, we talked about remove or minimize influences that reinforce disrespectful behavior and address the issues in a controlled setting where the inmate has fewer distractions or support from others. And I think that's something, even though we said it, I just want to be mindful. This is something I don't think a lot of people may do in the moment, especially if you feel that it is personal and they are attacking your pride, and it does become emotional, because now you're going to engage in the back and forth and want an immediate result, when right now you're looking for a longer term solution. So with that said, again, if it's not urgent or immediate, the chance to go back, reassess, and try to make sure that, I am going to go back and talk to this inmate, but right now is not the time, but it will happen. I'll pull the inmate out, maybe with a supervisor next to me or one of my peers, and we're going to try to see what's going on here. What's the conflict here? Let's try to figure this out. And we'll get to that later, where we start to have the discussions that lead towards what we expect from each other. And yes, it's okay to ask the inmate what they expect from you, and you in turn what you expect from them. But controlling the environment, I think, is one of the efforts towards long-term solution, because when you control that environment, that allows for the dialogue to kind of be one-on-one and more impactful. Because again, there's no counter influence. That means it's just me and you. And that's it. There's no one else there. I know for some extent I'm dealing with this individual. So let's see if they're going to carry this behavior on when there's no support. And here's the funny thing. For those that seek attention, especially in their efforts to be disrespectful, they want attention. Sometimes when you bring them in separate, you're giving them some level of attention. And they may respond to that no different than they would respond to people cheering them on, which is unique. Again, it's more about them wanting to seek attention. What's your thoughts on that, Joe?
Yeah, especially when you're dealing with one in a group setting, controlling the environment's a priority. Again, when you take the clown from the circus, he becomes an individual, not part of the circus anymore. It's always best to get them out, get them out of the environment, deal with them in a more controlled environment. Again, you don't want to try to address something and go headstrong into a situation where you don't have control of the environment and your surroundings. That's how people can get hurt. It's always best to kind of separate them from the group, and you don't have to do it at that instant. It could be something that could be done later on. He said what he said, and you know what? I got other shit to do. I'll deal with him here in just a little bit, just before I rack his ass up. I'll deal with him. Deal with him in an environment where you have control of it and he doesn't.
Yeah, and guys, this also goes to choose the right moment. Sometimes these are all connected, but you want to address the behavior when the inmate is calm and receptive, and timing matters. Addressing it strategically increases the impact of your message. So think about that, as we just mentioned. You're bringing the inmate into an area where you control, and then it's a strategic approach to resolving the matter more long term. Again, you can't be, if you both are going back and forth in the heat of the moment, and you're both are chasing pride to some extent, that means you're viewing it as a win-loss. So if you're viewing it that way, so are they. So granted, they're not going to want to lose. And it's funny because even when I say that you bring them aside and you have that dialogue, it's not about a compromise, because you're not compromising, but rather you're showing them that they win as well as you together. Like, if you do what I expect, this is how much easier life will be for you and for me. But either way, ultimately, we could make this a win-loss, and I'm going to win all the time, or I could show you the benefit of us working together, where a win for me is easily a win for you. And again, that really does relate to the time and the strategic approach, and making sure that the inmate is receptive to what that is. And you know what, Joe, that could become where you may see the motive of someone just being intentional with just challenging and being disrespectful, or someone that's just having that moment and just reacting, because they could also just be reacting to what they feel their peers want them to do. So you could have an inmate that's not normally disrespectful, but maybe something's going on, and now the inmates are pushing this inmate to react in a certain way. So now, with that said, maybe it's best, again, to pull them away from their peers, separate them from that influence, because that's the strategic approach. At this point, you are going to have an inmate that's more receptive, and then kind of try to figure out where this win will be for both of us. But again, still through me. The win gets filtered through me, because there's no win for you without a win for me first. But what's your thoughts on choosing the right moment?
Yeah, choosing the right moments is always a good thing. You were talking about it, and it led me back to a moment I remember in my career. I was probably, I don't know, it was about 4 years in as a CO, and running in and out on a cell block, and one of them towards the end of the cell block, started calling me all kinds of names and shit. And I knew who it was. He had a recognizable voice. So I hollered his name out on the run, and he just kind of got quiet. As I put them all back in their cells, You could tell that some of the inmates were charging them up to do that. And was walking around doing my count, coming back and passed by his cell, and he said, hey, officer, please, I'm sorry, man, don't write me up. I didn't mean it. They were just charging me up. I kind of looked at him as I was walking away, and I told him, I said, hell, I wasn't going to put it on paper. Everybody in here knows you're a hoe. I don't need to put it on paper to prove it. And the whole cell block just kind of erupted in laughter. And from that point on, I never had any problems with disrespect. And again, it's all about choosing the right moment. Again, I had control of the situation because they were all in their cells, and it was a good comedy relief breaker for everybody. And because of the fact that I didn't necessarily put it to paper, but dealt with it the way I did, kind of got me a little more respect than if I'd have just put it on paper. But again, choosing the right moment is key. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to address something right then and there if you don't have to, if it's not something that's, hindering the security practices or, creating an immediate danger. You got plenty of time in the shift to address it, when you're walking your runs or doing ins and outs. It doesn't take but a minute to pull one aside and say, hey, look out, man. When you're coming out, I know you had that cover on your life. When you go in, I want that shit taken down. Yes, sir. It doesn't, choosing the right moment is key.
Yeah. And for the next one, set clear expectations. Obviously, this will be done on that strategic, more long-term approach. You have to make sure that the inmate is receptive to the long-term approach. And by the way, this could be a battle too. You may set expectations and there could always be a back and forth, but I will say this, and I actually have this in a couple of my books. But when it comes to setting expectations, I do believe that even though you're setting the foundation for those expectations, the inmate also has to see how they benefit from it. I mean, they could give two shits how the facility benefits from it. And, if they don't have respect for you or they don't even know you yet, they could really give two shits how you benefit from it. So somehow or another, when you express your expectations, you have to express it in a fashion that they can see a direct and immediate benefit to them, which again, if you act okay, I'm not on your ass all day. I'm sure there's certain things you don't want me seeing, but if you want to be an ass, then I'm going to be on you all day, and that's not what we want. And then eventually when you start to build that trust, it's funny how your expectations and their expectations start to fully align as one. It really does. It fully aligns as one, because then they start to see that, maybe at first this is who I need to be. And then eventually, once they start to see that this works, they start to see the benefit of it all. And then it's more about how they want to be. And now it helps them deal with the struggle of counter influence, because, when you need to be something, it's external pressure, right? But when you want to be it, it's inspired, it's internal. So therefore, if there's counter influence, you may have enough in you to say, stop. This is not where I want to go. But again, it takes a while to set those expectations, but I've seen it. I've had dialogues with inmates where the expectations were set, and then you could see them struggling because the environment wouldn't want those positive expectations. But eventually the struggles became less because the inmate went from needing it to wanting it. And then the other inmates started to see this individual as, they're just kind of going to go this path. So I'm not going to sit here and, waste our energy trying to get this inmate to showboat when this inmate is not about showboating anymore. But that set clear expectations to me is one of the best things I was ever taught in an effort to gain compliance in long term. What's your thoughts on that, Joe?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. But, on the flip side, when you set your expectations, you got to have follow up. Say what you mean what you say. And, I remember, as an officer, when I hit a cell block, they already knew for the most part, how I was, but I would announce it anyway, to the cell block. This is your one informal warning. When you guys come out, I want your beds made. You're going to be fully dressed before you hit my run. If you have any trash in your cell, get it out of your cell, and make sure your lights aren't covered. Be tight and right when you hit my run. And there's gonna be times where you're new and you set those expectations, and they're gonna try you. 3 or 4 disciplinary reports later, they know that you mean what you say and say what you mean. So when you set the expectations, be prepared to follow them up. Sometimes you're gonna have to. Sometimes you're gonna have to set the tempo by formal means, and it's just one of those things. Once you get the first 3 or 4 disciplinaries out of the way, the rest of them are going to kind of fall in line and know that this one's not worth bucking.
Yeah, and remember, guys, you have to live by those expectations as well. Else you're a hypocrite and you won't get that respect. We also have focus on accountability, not punishment. So this emphasizes the need for respect and accountability and not power authority struggles. And we kind of touched on that. I mean, this is really about building things for the long term. I mean, I'm going to tell you something. If you're an officer and all you're doing all day is exercising your authority, you're going to get weared out pretty thin. I mean, you're hoping eventually at one point that you move past that and people just start dealing with what's expected. So your presence gives you what's needed as opposed to you having to constantly exercise it. I find people that constantly exercise it don't really have it established. So therefore, they're just exercising authority constantly. And it's like, if I'm a supervisor walking in the unit, it's like I'm telling the officer, well, if you're not on them, they're not going to do what's right. What are you kidding me? But then you can work with other officers who they don't have to be on them. There's an expectation there, and just the officer comes in and the inmates get to where they need to be. I think the biggest thing when it comes to authority, and this is really says a lot about the officer, is what's being done when you're not present. I have seen officers not work, have their day off and not work the unit. And there's inmates that are still in compliant with what the officer would expect, even on their day off. So it's like, well, hold on, we better not do that because Officer Proponio doesn't like it. Well, Officer Proponio is not here. It doesn't matter. He doesn't like it. So, I mean, these are expectations that go far past your immediate presence. And again, that's long-term, takes a while, but definitely does help you as you, it's just too tiring to do it the other way. And the other thing we have is you offer the opportunity for the inmates to recognize and correct their behavior. And that matters too. That's why we said before, you don't want to be quick to go to that final result and write things up, because I think you're relying too much on the authority side to maneuver and less on your ability to gain respect through those challenging moments. I do agree, as long as you're not being walked over. I mean, obviously there are things you're going to have to document. We'll get to that, but there are times where maybe you could address it and build respect through what could be a negative interaction. That's how you get respect. You get respect when you try to maneuver through the negative interaction to something that, one, establishes your expectations, but also lets the inmate know that this is what you're about. And, I expect compliance in these areas. What's your thoughts on that, Joe?
Yeah. I mean, you can gain accountability without punishment. I've done it numerous times over the course of my career. As an example, I've walked the runs and see these guys that are peeling paint off of their cell walls, and we just painted the cells 6 weeks ago, so I'd come back with a butt can, a paintbrush with some paint in it, and let them know, hey, you got 20 minutes to get this entire cell painted, or you're going to get a 30-day lick. There are ways of achieving your goal without being formal about it. And, when you set your expectations and hold them accountable, they find in the end run, you know what, Pomponio's been dead on our ass about getting these cells cleaned. And you know what, it smells better in here. We don't have the ant problems. We don't have this. We don't have that problem. The trash smell is gone. There are ways you can gain accountability without going through the formal means of punishment. If you can teach them a lesson and with repetition, they wind up falling in and doing it on their own without you having to tell them, bonus.
Yeah. And you know what, Joe, I like that, because I think when it comes to accountability, there's a mutual benefit, where punishment, it's like, well, only if I don't get caught. where I may want to go ahead and push expectations so the inmate understands what accountability is. It's definitely part of rehabilitation. So they know I may not be able to catch you all the time, but the point is this is about you. This is more about you than it is about me, where the punishment is, if you want to lead that way, this is more about the inmate not getting caught. So you're not going to have eyes on them 100% of the time. So with that said, the inmate there, I just don't think it sets long-term respect. It's like, okay, well, if I don't get caught, I'll still do it, where accountability is more longer term because it still remains present when you're not.
Yeah.
I think that's well said. Now, obviously, I do have to put this in fairness, document and report if necessary. So if the behavior escalates or continues, follow proper procedure for documentation and disciplinary action. So this is more of maybe the patterns that could be developed when the person's intentionally disrespectful. Situational concerns could be reactionary, and we talked about that. But if there's patterns, then maybe there's some level of mental health that needs to be involved with that. But I'm more focused here on the intentional disrespect that just seems to be a pattern that gets developed. And at that point, there may be a certain time where it's like, you know what, this isn't working. I've tried these efforts. It's not working. Now I'm going to put it on paper. And this has nothing to do with accountability, rehabilitation, none of that. This is more about you are going to be held responsible now. And this is just to show you the immediate consequences of your actions, because at this point here, there's just no talking to you. There's just no talking to you. And I don't have time, one, to be doing this every day, or two, to allow this to happen in my unit. Because, granted, especially if you're working in a dorm, you got one inmate that's disrespectful, man, especially in a dorm, it could cause chaos if other people start to align with that disrespect. But would you agree with this, Joe?
Yeah, I mean, others will easily fall in line if you don't address it. If you address it verbally the first time and it doesn't work the second time, then yeah, I mean, it's time to go ahead and document it. If you don't, the inmate's going to think that you're weak. You're not wanting to do anything about it, and the other inmates will kind of hone in on that. And usually, if you don't correct it, you start to open up the doors for another circus, and before you know it, you're dealing with a whole dorm instead of dealing with just one.
Yeah, and guys, the next one, we have two more left. The next one is be consistent. I want to mention something here. So be consistent is obviously, and we're talking about address disrespect each time it occurs to prevent it from becoming normalized. And then consistency shows you are fair, firm, and in control. So guys, granted, there could be a moment where maybe it's not safe to address it, but you may have to reapproach it later on. But I think it makes a powerful. It becomes powerful where, like, let's say Joe's acting up in the moment, and it's just not, I'm just not going to get the win in the long run with this if I approach Joe now. So I may hold off. But later on, I may come down that wing or come by the cell and say, hey, Joe, you got to step out for something. We got to talk about what happened earlier. And it's okay if a couple of inmates hear that too. Because a couple of inmates will know that, hey, he didn't get a free pass earlier today. Maybe I just wasn't. I'll give you an example. I mean, there's some facilities that still actually have staff walking in yards and walking in mess halls. So if you got an inmate being disrespectful, unless you need to, I would be very careful with engaging in a back and forth with that inmate. But with that said, that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It means once the environment's more controlled, you have that dialogue, and it doesn't hurt to, maybe even let the inmate know in the moment, hey, we'll discuss this a bit later. Right now, it's just not the time, but we'll discuss this a bit later. So the other inmates can see that this person did not get a freebie. That's the biggest thing. I know a lot of people want to initially address because they don't want everyone else to think that this person's getting a freebie. Just be careful with, the immediate need to push that. There's still ways that you can address it later, and the inmates will find out that the inmate didn't get the freebie. It just may mean that they don't know in the moment. They'll know maybe an hour or two later when it's safe to approach you, like maybe count time. Hey, step out for a second, just me and you real quick. What's going on with you today? I let you get this off earlier today, but I think we're coming to a time now where either the shit's going to stop or you're going to wind up finding yourself disciplined. So why don't you tell me what's going on and we'll see what we can do. But if not, you do this again, and A, B, C, D. And again, it may not be an immediate response, but it does settle. It does kind of give you that long-term where the inmates can see, you know what, he doesn't allow for a freebie, and he's going to talk to you later about that. Watch. What's your thoughts on that, Joe?
Yeah, don't be wishy-washy about what you enforce. Enforce it all. Be consistent about it. I've there's been situations that have kind of, jumped off where, one might be just totally disrespectful verbally, calling me everything but a child of God, and I'm walking a run doing count time. I'm not going to stop count time to deal with somebody who's locked up calling me all kinds of bitches and hoes. I'll go about my count, finish turning in my count, and, it's say like breakfast time, we're getting ready to roll chow. I'll line up 25, and as they're entering the chow hall, I'll pull him aside and let everybody see me pull him aside. And, let him know that won't be tolerated anymore. And if he does it again, we're going to go formal with it. And once he gains a good understanding that you're not going to take it anymore, then I'll send him into the chow hall and then let him go tell his fellow peer inmates, when they go to asking, hey, why did Pomponio pull you out of line for chow? Oh man, he got my ass about that situation earlier, man. And I shouldn't have done it. It is what it is. And, so there's always going to be a time that you can address it. You don't have to get after it right then, but be consistent. Don't, address it one thing one day and not address it the next. If you're going to address one thing, address it every time. You just get to pick the time when you address it. If you got time where you can, continue on with your job and go about your task and address it at a later point, you can. But don't get yourself into a rut where, you go to work and somebody's cussing you and you're like, you know what, I'm not even going to deal with that. I'm not, he's just running his head. No, it needs to be addressed, because if you address it one day and you don't address it the next, and then you address it the next day, then somebody's going to say, well, you didn't address it yesterday when Ganji called you an asshole. So why are you coming to me? So that's why it's important to be consistent in your enforcement of rules and regulations.
Yeah, and guys, when it comes to addressing it, obviously the situation and the environment may add pressure as to when's the best time to address it. So granted, obviously you could adapt with some strategy, but you don't want to address it where it's not in agreement or in alignment with the situation or the environment is going to allow. So granted, the situation being the predominant thing, you can maybe, if lucky, put the inmate in an environment where it's a little bit more controlled, but the situation has to allow for the chance for that resolution. But if it doesn't, then you may just have to react because it's emergent. And, a disrespect during an emergency is a lot different than disrespect during a normal walkthrough. There's a moment where the disrespect is going to be zero tolerant as defined by the situation. And you have to know when that is, and at that point, there will be zero tolerance for that disrespect. But that's not really to resolve it. That's just more, I got to get this out of the way because it's a distraction. And at this point, I have to react. And this is my favorite part. This is the last part, reflect and learn. When it comes to dealing with disrespect, this is where you have your role and it kind of intertwines with you being human and authenticity. And I love going back and looking at things in two ways. What the role expects from me, but also at some level what I expected from myself. Because sometimes my interpretation of what the role expects from me, the end game, could make me wind up being a bit more aggressive than I need to be. So the goal is always going to be what is the outcome and how does that best align with who I need to be in a long-term basis, because I want to be authentic with the inmates. So I don't want to, I know I got to get to an outcome, but I want to make sure the outcome filters through something that I can maintain and be seen as authentic, as opposed to all of a sudden I try to be this tough person when the inmates know I'm not. So again, I like this reflection. I have analyzed the situation afterward to identify improvements for handling similar incidents in the future, and then share lessons learned with peers to strengthen collective responses to impacts. or to disrespect. So, guys, I think at this point here, this is where I keep my journal. This is where most of my books come from, because I loved the interaction. And most of my books that I've written are based on interactions and, 6 ways I could have done things. And, and ask myself, why didn't I go this way? Why didn't I go that way? And then finding what I feel could be best as determined by the situation and what the situation allows. Don't get me wrong. You can always influence the environment, but the situation is always what has the strongest hold. So I want you guys to know that when you're engaging in interactions with the inmates, be mindful that the situation has the greatest impact. So you have to understand the situation and then figure out where you need to maneuver. The best people that work in corrections know how to maneuver around different situations because they have kind of did the what if you will, tactically, have tried multiple ways that, like for me, when I journal, I would present different ways I could approach something, and then different ways the outcome could have went. And then I go for where I feel gives me the best outcome. And again, it's usually something that is never going to be 100%. It's never going to be perfect, but it's something I can defend if need be. Joe, reflect and learn, journaling a little bit, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about the journaling part, but reflecting and learning, that's how you gain experience in corrections. Some people call it reflect and learn. I call it trial and error. It's always going to be something. There's always going to be a takeaway from every situation that you're in, whether it's positive or negative. It's going to give you a better handle of what not to do, what to do. It's kind of like it's almost like playing a game. You come to a dark door and you got the choice to either open it or walk away from it. You have choices in the way that you handle your scenarios, and the way that you handle them. You're either going to gain compliance and some respect, or you're going to gain a little bit of negativity and a learning scenario. It's always something it's gonna be ongoing in your correctional career. You'll have plenty of time to reflect. Later on, you may have one of those aha moments and go, you know what, I've screwed that situation all up. I could have done that different. I could have done that better, and probably would have saved a whole bunch of heartache and maybe my lieutenant a little bit of paperwork. And that's when you're learning, because if you're reflecting back on a situation that went wrong and you're kind of mulling it over in your brain how you could have done that better, then you're already learning.
I like that, Joe. Hey, Joe, anything you'd like to say in closing?
Yeah, I mean, I hope this kind of gives y'all an idea of how to, be professional in your careers. Like I said, there's going to be times where you have to take charge of the situation because of its, impeding dangers. And there's going to be times where, you don't necessarily have to go in there with a heightened sense of anger or heightened sense of disrespect. In this profession, you kind of get what you give. So, just remember that if you have to deal with a situation, make sure you're dealing with it consistently on a daily basis. Don't, enforce the rule on one and not enforce it on anybody else. Be consistent in the way you enforce your regulations. Be mindful of the scenarios that you put yourself in. Don't wear your pride on your shoulder and get yourself into a situation where you're going to get your ass whipped. That's something we don't want, something we don't need. So be mindful that, pride has a bad way of getting you hurt. And sometimes not only you, but your coworkers, if they got to come save you and they wind up getting hurt in the process. Pride is a huge risk in the corrections profession. So, if you're wearing your feelings on your sleeve, stop. Make sure when you're dealing with a scenario, make sure it's safe to do so. You don't have to, if it's something minute where, he got your goat or he got the best of you, you don't have to address it right then. You don't have to deal with it right then. There's going to be times where you can get them in a more controlled environment later on and deal with the scenario. But the main thing is be firm, fair, and consistent in the way you enforce rules. And again, I said it numerous times, and I'll say it again: if you don't address it, you bless it. So don't impede on one and not enforce on the others.
Yeah, and guys, just for my closing, guys, we are going to deal with disrespectful inmates, conflict, and I always tell people in corrections you chase conflict because it gives you a chance to establish who you need to be, of course, in line with who you want to be. So it gives you a chance to try to approach things long term, and then maybe whatever you do in those moments can echo, throughout, maybe to the rest of the inmates, to your peers. So moments like this could be something that you could welcome, because this could be a chance where you could solidify what you tolerate, what you won't tolerate, and again, not on impulse, but rather more long term. It's sad if people jump on these moments to immediately react and then wind up not setting anything that can really give you a strong foundation for future occurrences. I mean, I'll tell you something, guys. When you have an interaction like this, everybody's watching. So one moment can go in your favor, or it could take you right to hell. So, it's good to know that, when the moment comes, this is what I'm going to do if the moment allows it to happen. That's another thing. Take that into account. When you feel that you're pushing your authority and it's not getting anywhere, you could be pushing your authority into a situation that's not allowing for that authority to exist. And therefore, the effort is going to be fruitless. I'll tell you one thing about authority is could be strategic in its approach as well. If the situation doesn't allow for it to exist in a more long-term strategic approach, then we can go back and revisit again, as long as it doesn't require that immediate reaction. Again, someone told me, we talked about what you ignore, you accept. Also, basically, there are times you react and times you respond. We want to respond, but the reactions help us to respond because there are lessons that are learned. But at this point here, if you have a good senior officer or someone that you can learn from, or if you've done it before and you got the experience, you wind up responding more because the expectations are already set. So I think it's, this was a great dialogue, guys. Hopefully people take what they can from it. As always, guys, the show is Teardrop. If you haven't, please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. Bell's going to notify every time I post a video. Stay safe.